we just ticked over to 4:32, so I might jump in. I think I can see a few more people streaming in as we go, but let's get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Eamon Waterford. I'm the Deputy CEO of the Community for Sydney and our Head of Policy, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this event. The first thing I'd like to do is to do an acknowledgement of country. I'd like to pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. Although we're meeting online and we'll be sitting in different parts of Sydney or the world, I'm currently on Gadigal land, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders. Today we've got a special guest presenter, Theo Blackwell, MBE. Theo was appointed in 2017, in fact 3 years today, so congratulations Theo on that, as London's first Chief Digital Officer. He leads London-wide digital transformation, data and smart cities initiatives at City Hall. He also chairs the Smart London Board, which has recently established an Emerging Technologies Charter. It's a set of criteria that digital innovations are based on artificial intelligence, blockchain, virtual reality, and many other types of technology, and how they should be deployed in London. This has been inspired by related initiatives in cities like San Francisco, Boston, Helsinki. Mayor Sadiq Khan requested that the charter be developed in a bid to ensure that London capitalises on the benefits of emerging technology, while also minimising potential negative impacts. So today, Theo's going to talk about the charter, but he's also going to give us some broader thoughts about his role as the head of digital for a city that Sydney often likes to learn from, and the impact of emerging technologies on cities more broadly. So Theo, welcome. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you.
You are currently not in London.
I'm just outside of Hazelmere, just outside of London.
Thank you for joining us today. We really do appreciate it. What I might do is I might ask you to share your screen, and if you want to jump in, while you're doing that, Theo, I might just do some I'm missing the word, but orders of business for people. If you would like to ask a question, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You just type your question into there, and then we'll be running through a Q&A after Theo has presented some of his thoughts. So Theo, to you, take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Eamon, for that welcome. And it's a pleasure to be speaking to you this morning. And I'm just going to run through the work we're doing to develop an emerging technology charter for London, the reasons why and how it fits into our program in London. So let me start by giving you a short, smart history of London over the last 2 decades, starting with the creation of Transport for London, which is an agency really obviously vital to London, but in terms of how it fits in, London has the advantage of a transport agency that directly serves the boundaries of London, unlike some other cities where the transport agency might be run by a regional government. Transport for London is accountable to the mayor, and it's been a great source of innovation, and much of the story about how London's a smart city does come from Transport for London. So the congestion charge, essentially a system which whereby cameras record license plates coming in and out of the central zone, levying a charge, reducing congestion, is essentially, our first modern example of a smart technology. Citizens directly benefited through the Oyster card, replacing tickets, therefore reducing queues and giving people more flexibility in their travel. In 2010, London was one of the first cities to create an major open data platform, starting off with 600 data sets, now up to about 6,000, and that brings together government information and other information into one publishing platform to be used by academia and also internally in the GLA for deriving actionable insights so we can make the city better, principally about planning and economic development. 2014, contactless travel arrived. TfL's Transport for London's adoption of contactless travel, and therefore London's adoption of contactless travel, gave the additional benefits of what we had from the Oyster card, reducing queues and creating more flexibility for people, but also popularized pretty much contactless payment for the UK. We gained a major funding program from the European Union starting 5 years ago, working with about 80 European cities and becoming a lighthouse city for the development of smart thinking around building retrofit and e-mobility, piloting initiatives in the London Borough of Greenwich near the O2 Centre. Since Sadiq Khan became mayor, we've developed open call approaches. We've introduced the open call approaches to solve civic problems, to engage with scale-ups in the tech sector. We've introduced the ultra-low emission zone, a sort of derivation of the congestion charge to tackle poor air quality, connected autonomous vehicle trials in Greenwich and the Olympic Park. We created the London Office of Technology and Innovation, a new institution working with the majority of London boroughs to pilot and scale new innovation in participating boroughs. So instead of being a city divided into 32 boroughs and a collection of expensive pilots, we're looking at how boroughs can collectively work together to meet citizen need. And equally, transport innovation team at TfL was created to think out of the box further, again using open call approaches. And as we sort of think about the next decade, we're thinking about how we develop a new city data platform, the next version of the London Data Store, engaging with private sector data and sensor data as well. And I think crucially, purpose of this conversation, how we develop a framework for public and innovator trust. And that's called the Emerging Tech Charter for London. So a little bit about my job. As mentioned, appointed 3 years ago, the mayor's ambition just before I was appointed in London Tech Week was for London to be the smartest city in the world. And he expressed it in a certain way. He wanted London to be a test bed for civic innovation where the best ideas are developed, amplified and scaled. I work with the Central Intelligence Unit within the GLA, which runs the data store and does our major planning and economic analysis, and the digital transformation team, plus all of the major spending departments. I established and sit on the board of LOTI, London Office of Technology and Innovation, and work with all of the major agencies there. I try and sort of practice what I preach. I work in the open. We publish our ongoing work openly on Medium, and also we, for the first 2 years, recorded our progress on the Smarter London Together roadmap just on an open Trello board, so everybody could see our progress and what we'd changed and what we'd stopped and what our findings were. So what's going to happen with technology over the next 15 years in London? Well, we commissioned a report from the Digital Catapult, and it outlined what was called London's advanced technology stack. On the one hand, you've got a advanced digital infrastructure, 5G and future networks currently being developed in universities and research labs, artificial intelligence becoming more intelligent, if you like, a growth in IoT, partly as a result of 5G, and deep into the future, the potential of quantum computing. And then next to that sits a digital service layer. That includes immersive and extended reality, robotics, autonomous machines, distributed ledger technologies, blockchain, and even brain-to-computer interfaces down the line. Now, some of these things are obviously just being prototyped at the moment, but the specialisms within our tech sector in London are developing these things. And of course, it's not unique to London. These will be developed across the world. So when we talk about what a smart city is, we need to incorporate this phenomenal tech stack that is coming down the line, from autonomous vehicles, remote operated cranes, smart logistics, and the wealth of new products and services that will arise from this massive explosion of data. Our physical environment is likely to change through extended reality, which itself will be underpinned by a vast amount of real-time data. And that will create what the Digital Catapult dubs the physical internet, a more clickable city, a city that is much more interactive and rich with local data. And that has applications, of course, for tourism, retail experiences to draw people back to the high street, and leisure. And we also see this sort of augmentation of the physical self, the convergence with design, our life sciences sector, even our fashion industries, to surface lightweight wearable technologies to enhance the way that we work. These will be created and on offer. This will allow people to click or press buttons in a virtual touch-free environment. Ultimately, Catapult postulates to break down barriers, for example, for disabled people, the potential to use robotic assistance to aid walking. So quite often in smart cities discussions, we talk, about big platforms and mobility and, in a sense, the near future. But we want to, we want to think about the kinds of things that are being developed now, and create a more consistent foundation for that development. So when these technologies drop in our city, they drop in a benevolent environment, a trusted environment, and they don't take us by surprise. And that's been one of the challenges of some emerging technologies, live facial recognition technologies, even down to e-scooters in some places. So this question of trust, I think, is really important for city government, and we do have a fundamental role in that, a role that's kind of different from government regulation. We're closer to the citizen and, in a sense, closer to the innovators. So we know that the technologies will bring great benefits to our cities, new jobs and growth, but also to a whole range of civic activities. Our urban space will be changed dramatically. So new areas that are being planned now to start being built in 5-6 years' time will naturally will contain a vast amount of more of technology than places that today we consider new. And I walk around King's Cross in London, which I helped formerly as a councillor in the London Borough of Camden. I was leading on in terms of regeneration, and that is a new area of London, but the technologies will effectively have to be retrofit after a while. And compare that to the kind of technologies that will go into the Royal Docks, major development in the East End, starting in a few years' time. And we have a different kind of city, but there are also obviously significant applications for retrofit. So some of the challenges around trust are privacy, of course, but I think broader than privacy, this sense of transparency. Technology sometimes attract criticism as black box technology. So if they're deployed in our city, how do we provide that appropriate public accountability? We know that there's risk around bias, whether it's data drawn from ourselves or data or the way a technology itself is designed, leading to groups in society to be harmed or have their rights impinged by those biased systems. And there's been a particular challenge around live facial recognition technology, its ability to identify people based on race, which has been part of the discussion here when we've piloted that technology, and certainly been a part of the discussion in the United States. So even potentially equitable proposals arising from AI can make heavy weather if we follow the route of smart technology, which is solutionist rather than bringing citizens in right at the beginning. So how can we design AI and emerging technologies with citizens in the civic setting? civic trust can also be undermined as a consequence of disruption to jobs and industries. There's tremendous challenge, obviously, in taxicab trade as Uber dropped in London and disrupted the cab trade. You can see other areas where that civic trust is undermined if there isn't a proper consideration about how people are retrained and how industries are shifted during this period. And of course, innovators and investors need a trusted and trusting home to prototype and deploy their products and services. And we want London to be home to that innovation. And we want to create a welcoming environment, but do so, with our eyes wide open, have an honest, open conversation with people about this. And we think that's the best and most sustainable way. So where this all fits in is we developed a Smart London Together roadmap about 2 years ago. We did the biggest exercise on smart city technology and its application in London and our priorities. We based it on a mission-based approach, championing user-centered design, better city data down the side of the column. But really what people were telling us is we need to do two things. One, we needed to fix the plumbing, not get ahead of ourselves when we talk about smart city technology. And fix the plumbing meant ensure that we had a full fiber legacy that provided decent broadband to businesses and residents, address our copper legacy, and prepare the ground for 5G. And secondly, to put people first. And putting people first, for us, we introduced common design principles and how digital technologies should be developed, both at City Hall and through our connection with London's boroughs. I'm not responsible for the technology estate of London's 32 boroughs, but we have influence through London Office of Technology and Innovation. Got an idea of our collective technology estate, so we now know what IT systems lie behind what the city delivers, to then open up a discussion about what our technology mix should be in the future. We created new city teams and institutions to focus on collaborative innovation. Lottie Transport Innovation Team, we're able to pilot scalable smart tech through those collaborative institutions. So again, not borough by borough, but 4 boroughs working together, 16 boroughs working together, etc., and created a more open call approach. And that the next step for us is to discuss the emerging tech values now that we've got that in place. So the mayor's ambition, as I said, was to create London as the smartest city in the world. And we found that often ways in which government set standards, for example, the government digital service design principles, often have an impact on wider ways of working in other sectors over time. So if we start with ourselves, we think there'll be a ripple effect the more we engage with the tech community around us. Our analysis shows, and anyone who's done anything on AI ethics will know, that there's already a vast amount of guidance, some helpful, some not very helpful, developed at a national level, developed by businesses, and developed by London agencies. But either it's very, very abstract, or it's been developed on a case-by-case basis. So it's not been consolidated into one place, and the general principles have not been abstracted from that. Now, some cities are beginning to consider how they set rules and engage with innovators, San Francisco, Boston, or otherwise share knowledge and intelligence. The Cities Coalition of Digital Rights brings together many European cities and a couple of American ones as well to talk about sort of a rights-based emerging technology deployment in their cities. Again, high level, but it's an interesting way of bringing people like me together to discuss common issues. So our aim is for a short charter published at the end of the year, followed by further design with stakeholders and the public. Its charter starts as voluntary guidance, such as our good work standard, which is which sets standards for businesses around new digital economy, service jobs, pay and conditions. But we see it as something that could be incorporated as advisory, either into planning guidance or in future procurements. And the 4 areas we want to address is ways of working. We want to ensure that trialing new technologies is conducted openly and responsively, actively engaging with the public, authorities, and other relevant bodies. So in those two areas there, we will create rules of thumb on how you should talk to Transport for London, how you should talk to the Mayor of London's office if you're an innovator, and suggestions on how you might want to engage in the public, and underline the principle that you should work in the open. Secondly, we'll make recommendations on the collection, use, and sharing of data, serving up, for example, our desire, particularly around climate change, for emerging technologies to agree to share their data on either openly or privately on the city data platform, starting with climate change, but because that's a pressing common issue for everyone. We already have some really good soundings from the private sector that this is an area in which people would like to engage if they were given an easy way to do that. Thirdly, design principles. We want to make sure that we promote the best in design. Obviously, we've got a great design history in London, and to ensure that design principles and the user voice are carried through when new technologies are developed and deployed, to ensure that accessibility and diversity are at the heart of innovations. So effectively, this means that we would like the kind of principles that we use when we develop our own technologies. We'd like emerging technology innovators to be mindful of them and show us their workings. Finally, privacy and security. So not just doing the letter of the law on GDPR, but living it. So for example, every organization is required to do a data protection impact assessment if it's coming forward with a new technology that relates to the public. At the moment, these are just published by the organization. We can offer up a service where people can publish them openly on the London Data Store. So we can have an aggregate of DPIAs. We have transparency in our city, which could lead towards analysis, challenged by civil society, and moves towards good practice as well. So already we're trying to sort of shape our thinking into the sort of practical measures that bring more openness and transparency, deal with that black box challenge that in a sense is foremost in our minds over emerging technologies. So our next steps is to bring together existing guidance. Transport for London's Connected Autonomous Vehicle Trial Guidance is, I think, a particularly good document setting out expectations to innovators on how they should communicate to TfL and the public. The recommendations from the Metropolitan Police Service's Live Facial Recognition Ethics Panel is well worth reading in its discussion about diversity and bias. We did a major exercise with the public on the sharing of NHS data for the improvement of the NHS just before the pandemic hit. So a citizens summit with a representative group of 100 Londoners who talked about their trade-offs and the kind of governance and transparency they'd like to see. So learning from that, and the government is extremely keen post Huawei that guidance around from the centre around from the National Cybersecurity Centre is incorporated into smart city thinking. And one of the challenges there is how do we make that into a sort of plain English guidance? So a job of work for us to do there. So we'll draft in the open from October. There'll be engagement with innovators, VCs, big tech, and all of the scale-ups that we work with. And we will also have a significant public engagement exercise via the Talk London platform. So our aim in the end, because of our limited powers in London, not something that is in a sense a new law, but I think we have a responsibility in a digital leadership challenge, being a hub to innovation and such a large city, to set down our values as a basis of further conversation with emerging technologies, so we can be a good place to do business and ultimately bring benefits to our citizens. So thank you very much.
Wow, congratulations. That's great stuff that you're up to. How exciting. So you'll have to obviously imagine the applause of the crowd, the audience. A couple of questions have come through, and I've been jotting down some thoughts as well. So I'm gonna sort of start throwing some questions at you, if that's all right. For those of you in the audience, if you do have a question, at the bottom of the Zoom screen, there's a Q&A button. You can type in a question there, and I will do my best to get through them. I can see a bunch streaming through already, though. You talked a lot about some pretty exciting stuff you're up to. I guess one of the areas that we often think is quite important and maybe doesn't get talked about because it's not sort of flashy and shiny and new is how you shift culture within an organization to embrace new ideas and innovate and new technologies. How have you gone about shifting the culture of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor's Office, to embrace not just, I guess, specific technologies, but kind of an ethos of taking on new ideas and being open to working with organizations that wouldn't otherwise work with?
Through a number of means. When I was appointed, I ordered what's called a peer review, where you bring in other people from local government to kick the tires of the organisation around digital data and technology, and they made certain recommendations. I think that was a very important step to dispel any sort of residual view that just because the organisation was Greater London Authority, therefore it was leading in this area as it perhaps leads in other areas like economic regeneration. So that was important. We sent our senior team on a digital training exercise, and they each had a mentor. So the top 12 budget holders did that. And I think I was really fortunate in that a lot of the kind of philosophy that has been written for leaders around digital transformation had not only been done, but also good things had happened from that. And that's all of the work of Mike Bracken and Tom Loosemore at Government Digital Service. So in effect, I was saying, I think that actually the work of the Government Digital Service and its focus on digital delivery applies more to local government than it does central government. But well done for doing all you did in central government. But effectively, these principles are fundamental to London. So I was able to kind of riff on that tradition, which had already had some currency there. The final point I'd make is, we had to create new institutions to do things. It's particularly London Office of Technology and Innovation, and their ability to spin up and do things quickly, which was what they're set up to do, enabled us the greatest power of all, which is showing by doing.
That's interesting, and there's a related question that's coming from Mitchell Berger, who Theo, you're not expected to know who these people are, unless you recognise them. But hello, Mitchell, how are you going? It was reflecting on how you've gone about seeking funding and investment for digital infrastructure. It's a little bit, obviously it's intangible for many people compared to, say, building a bridge or a road. What's any advice on how you've sort of sold this to people who aren't tech natives?
Do you mean digital infrastructure in the sense of connectivity infrastructure, or do you mean digital infrastructure in terms of the technology estate?
Well, I don't know what Mitchell was, but let's say both, and start with the basics, with the fibre, the plumbing, as you
yeah. So London. So just on digital connectivity, London has effectively a fibre network to the cabinet, not necessarily to the home, in about 85% of the city. Some areas of central London, that produce the most GDP in the country, actually still have some of these copper connections. And there's been a market failure around that. So we rely effectively on the private sector to step in and do that, and their business models go after customers. And although there's different business models that have arrived recently, the fundamental problem is, we need to make a move. So what we've done in terms of digital connectivity is we've identified the vast public estate, tube tunnels, 400 kilometers of them, roads. There's something like 600,000 lampposts in London, believe it or not. Those are vital for small cells. And so Transport for London is leading at the moment a big concession for the use of its tunnels to put essentially a fibre spine right across London, connecting up to 600 public buildings that lowers the cost for investment for those private operators to go into areas that, frankly, they didn't go to before. So we think that, that move, which is obviously on a commercial arrangement from TfL, is a game changer for that. In terms of the business case for digital infrastructure, there's always a continuing case to be made for that. I think every organisation of the sort of, I'm saying GLA is old. I mean, it's 20 years old, but still it was created before all of this happened, needs to consider what its data capabilities are and what its digital making capabilities are as an organisation. And, we still have a way to go on that. Sometimes it's not top of the list. I think the most fundamental thing for me is that, let's say I want to build a new data store for London. I think the technology specification for what we propose doesn't actually cost a lot of money. What does cost a lot of money is some really good data analysts, some team leaders, project managers who are confident with data to go and talk to those domain experts to make the data store work for the city. So actually investments in people and attracting people to the public sector, not so much technology side.
That's interesting. That actually is a good segue to a question from David Holden, you talked about the next generation of the London data store, and it's similar to open data platforms that many cities have now, including New South Wales open data. What do you think that next generation looks like? How will it be different to what we've got currently?
That's a really good question. So our original data store was an open data publishing platform. Over time, it's managed to create a function which digests what we call closed data, so commercially sensitive data. For example, we've got something called the infrastructure mapping application, which brings together private data from construction projects and utilities. So they dig up the road once to put their thing in rather than many times. So that's really good for London, saves them on fines, saves congestion, etc. But that's a different thing from open data. And we've also managed to digest sensor data from our trials, smart trials in Greenwich. So the scope of what the data store did is actually, the function of the data store, what it does, is actually outgrown its scope. So our discovery exercise now is premised on, we don't have all of the data that we need to solve some of London's big problems, like climate change, poor air quality. We need other organizations to give us their data and share it with us. So we will not be like a big repository. We're not planning to sort of say, well, let's create a big smart city platform that you hear from some countries, particularly in Asia, that sort of create an all singing and all dancing platform that costs a lot of money. Think of it like a library index card. If libraries still work like this, they did when I went to university. But you go in there and it basically says this is where the book is, and then you go off. You either get someone to give you the book, or you go off and find it yourself. So our data store essentially would be a store of the metadata, the descriptions of the data, and where it's held. So then our role is to work with people to set the right projects, kind of set the standards on how data can easily be shared, but we act as a kind of library index card for a multi sort of data sovereign city, which also includes academia and bits of the private sector as well. So we think that kind of distributed model goes with the grain of how London works and is easier to do. and then we can invest less time thinking about, we need a massive technology platform. How does that stand up? And more time on the people to do stuff with the data.
Yeah, right. No, I like that, lean and but achievable. And I suspect the library analogy is helpful for people who don't, as a starting point.
Well, I mean, in Helsinki, they've got robots that give you your books now. So,
Sure. Well, I mean, in Amazon, fulfillment centers are using robots to send you your books, right? You don't even have to leave home.
Quite.
We're having a bunch of questions come in around 5G. Can you talk to us a little bit about what testbed work you're doing around 5G in London?
It's being deployed. We've got lots of private investment. We don't get any money from the government for 5G. I think we've applied about 4 times, and they've given it to other areas, as is the national policy of levelling up at the moment. So what we've got is essentially incubators in universities and private sector in investment. I think the big thing about 5G for me is 5G is not a standalone technology. It needs a full fiber infrastructure to work. I want to create a full fiber, proper full fiber infrastructure right across London. So they're not like 5G areas in one place and not 5G areas in another place because no one's invested there. So I want to make sure all of that plumbing is in place for future growth. I think there's still a big question about, what are the civic applications of 5G, especially in an environment where we've got not a lot of money because of the pandemic. So I think those kind of crossover moments, especially around public space and mobility, will happen. But my focus is to make sure that happens equitably across the city first. So let's not get too carried away with that bit. It's happening in universities and so on. It's certainly for this year, my focus is on sorting out that fiber spine.
Do you have, that makes sense, do you have much insight or sight on policies around placement and siting of the small cells for 5G? Is that something, the question specifically about what kind of policies are London using to place the things physically in space?
Well, the policy's set by national government. So they've got quite permissive legislation about where it goes. And obviously there's a bit of challenge. I mean, if we're sort of edging towards the discussion about, health challenge and whatever, there were a small minority of people during the pandemic who attacked masts and workers, often workers who were just doing.
You were spreading COVID, clearly.
Yeah, for all of that. And the government gave a really robust challenge to it. It was, there's some people who have clearly been wound up, sometimes by non-UK state actors in this, but also, obviously people who feel strongly as well. The government's got a very sort of clear framework around all of that, every now and again we deal with a challenge on this. But I remember this happening with 4G and 3G as well. So it's really important that the city government is able to respond and reassure people on these things. And I think as of late, the government's done a much better job on it. Remember, a lot of the national regulation around this is with the government. They create the framework that allows the proliferation of small cells on our property. So, I feel that they've stepped up to their responsibility to inform people and answer their concerns, legitimate, and debunk, some of the
slightly less legitimate ones. Yeah, and that's an interesting question. There's 3 different questions I'm going to kind of bundle together that relate to legislative barriers to implementing a kind of a digital future for the city. To what extent are you having to grapple with the legislative process in order to achieve the goals that you have in your role? Is this something where politics is getting in the way, where laws need to be passed in order to enable this stuff, or is it really a matter of culture and funding?
I think so at a national level, the government has, I think, if I was going to be critical, I'd say, how is it that we're in 2020, 10 years into kind of this wave of the digital revolution, and the government didn't have a national data strategy setting out in clear terms, not just how it shares data within it, within Whitehall, but also where a lot of the delivery data is in municipal government. Why wasn't that clearer? And I think, the lack of that and the lack of maturity around that has been very clear during the pandemic response. So it needs to sort that out. Because private utilities exist and they effectively do public things like water, electricity, and gas, I'd like to see a level of mandation. So we don't have to kind of just constantly do sort of voluntary, if you will, agreements on sharing data, because these things are vital for fuel poverty and climate change. So I think there should be there should be a regulation about forcing the sharing of data with those companies in particular, and the city. They are vital infrastructure. And the government has also muddied around on, it designed, just going back to the point about the location of small cell technology, it designed regulations in a very permissive way with industry to put these on buildings, and that took away much of the goodwill and funding incentive to cash-strap local authorities to fund connectivity teams to make sure these things happened. And it's been tied up in the courts for 2 years, and I think that was like a particular a government failure, because it just sort of saw municipal authorities as sort of bureaucracy and red tape standing in the way of all of this innovation, rather than partners in solving a problem and making progress. So because of its sort of like mindset because of the government's mindset towards government, it missed an opportunity to enhance digital leadership, especially around digital connectivity. So I think it kind of realizes it now. But you need all players at the table to have a reasonable discussion about, next steps.
Right. Interesting. One interesting question Amy Eastham has asked. So Transport for London sound like they're a pretty major partner for you. Have they had to change any of their infrastructures that they already have in motion, things like Crossrail, to accommodate new digital infrastructure? And how has that been handled? Or has that in fact been a roadblock to rolling out some of these technologies? The fact that major infrastructure projects, have multi-year delivery windows, and halfway through, it turns out the technology that you're embedding in it is no longer fit for purpose or best practice.
Crossrail, had it opened on schedule, would have been the first part of the network where you could have had your 4G connectivity. So I think they've planned it in well. I think Transport for London saw a kind of really major ambition to use the 4,400 kilometers of pre-dug tunnels and ducting as the next step in its delivery. I've been really impressed by TfL's technology savviness. I think they're now. I think the next step for TfL isn't, having fulfilled its ambitions in that area, is really getting a handle not just on its open data, but actually the vast amount of data, of customer data that it has, to create a more personalised experience for Londoners. so that people can choose to walk, cycle, take public transport, e-scooters, the like. And I think that would be kind of like a really major thing for TfL to do, sort of to have something curated for you, the Londoner.
Sorry, I'm muting between because I have a small child running around in the background. But that's really, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Look, it feels like we're jumping all over the place. I do apologise, but man, there's so many good questions coming in so many different areas that I really want to try and cover the plethora and breadth of them. Michelle Kramer has asked a question. You flagged that the work that you're doing will cover design and how we make sure that digital is embedded in the design of new places, new precincts. Are there any first principles or learnings on what best in design might look like as far as embedding that in spatial design, physical design?
So we're about to, what this chart, without kind of saying we're producing a bunch of charters that are all interlinked, we are producing a bunch of charters that are all interlinked, but we're also, our planners are also doing some work on what's called the Public London Charter, which sets out modern expectations about the design, public access, and sort of livability of public spaces the public perceive as public, but are in fact run by private landowners. So increasing part of the city. And that will be published imminently in the next few weeks. It also includes a section on digital and privacy as well. And that will be a voluntary set of guidance, slightly stronger than my proposed charter, that sits below the New London PAN, which is really our strongest lever, apart from money, at City Hall, our planning powers. So that's all being set out there. So sort of watch that space.
Sorry, I'm furiously texting my partner about the crying child in the background. That's all good. That makes sense, and we'll look out for that. We've got probably time for one or two more questions, and probably looming large over this. And we had a little conversation before the event started. The impact of COVID on everybody's work. Have you started to see any of the smart innovations, any of the work that you've been doing being accelerated as a result of COVID? Has this been an opportunity to try on new things or to see opportunities come out of this, or indeed has this just been something that's held back a lot of the progression in this space?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I think I'll give two examples of where things that we've been piloting have been repurposed to meet COVID response challenges. So in the London Borough of Sutton, we were piloting on-demand busing. So not set bus routes, but you have responsive bus routes according to need and according to days. That technology actually served a really good purpose when that particular local authority, representing about 300,000 people, had to do food deliveries to the vulnerable, because they could take it straight to the door. Who the vulnerable person was could be on a system which was secure, as opposed to, goodwill of volunteers, community hall, pieces of paper, names, etc. And that was a really good example of like how that service actually was very adaptable for a need in that particular climate. And kudos to the tech team over there who realised that it could be done. And secondly, we've repurposed a project that we've been doing with the Turing Institute, which is sort of National Institute for Artificial Intelligence based in King's Cross. And that was about to publish an open API on air quality data in London using a variety of sources, including Transport for London's cameras. It's about 900 cameras on its network. And that would have given you a kind of like 48-hour air quality weather reports. So you could say, I'm not going to jog down this road today. I'll go for walk that route, school run, etc. Because it has a very deep understanding of traffic modelling. We're able to, with a research grant, we're able and work with Microsoft UK, repurpose that really important smart city work to start modelling busyness in the city, because essentially we're using the same data, people footfall from cameras, so it doesn't kind of recognize you, the individual, it just counts people moving by. Car and bus footfall. We've brought in other private data sets, including the one from MasterCard. And so that data that was predominantly used for air quality is now the basis of combining with other data sets for us to assess the viability of high streets and health of high streets compared to normal, and also compared to sort of net zero, which was deep lockdown, which is as close to no economic activity as you can get. So that will give us that gives us therefore insights into areas of London that are particularly struggling over the long term and haven't bounced back, on top of that kind of quarterly data, because this is all, of course, live real-time data. So those are two examples that I'd give of smart city innovations.
Really cool. Man, that's really cool. The high streets business stuff, such a smart, novel pivot during a time when, air quality is probably actually doing all right and doesn't need. So the one last question. It relates to everybody's favorite topic, procurement. One of the challenges that I know we're facing in New South Wales, we have a state government and local governments really keen to drive a smart cities future for Sydney, but often get caught in this challenge between how do you work with a firm to scale up an innovative way of doing things differently versus manage probity around procurement. And I don't think there's an answer to this, but I guess just your thoughts on how you guys have been managing procurement, where it might make sense to work very closely with one firm, but you also you don't want to be doing it in a way that provides you're picking winners in the private sector.
It's a really good question. I think we need to be wary of going down a route of a smart city just dealing with one or two firms. I think that was the historic model of like why this idea spun up. People were saying, yeah, we can integrate all of this for you, just hand over the keys. And I think now we think of a smart city in a much more distributed sense, that smart cities are where lots of things are happening, and we provide the kind of governance and connections so that ideas that pop up in one area can prosper somewhere else. So I think at first, I definitely think everyone should think about their technology mix. I'm not saying London's got it right, because if you step outside of smart cities and just think about our IT suppliers in London, I mean, we found out like 2 months ago that 90% of all IT in London to 32 boroughs, unbeknownst to them, was supplied by 15 suppliers. Now, is that the right technology mix for London, which has loads of scale-ups and startups? I mean, I don't think so. I mean, we suspected that was the case, but we didn't know. So I think city leaders need to treat IT and by implication smart cities not as back office, but there's a civic discussion about your technology mix and how you do things. And I think one approach that's really worked for us at the other end of the scale is open calls and open innovation challenges, where the police set a problem around tackling online extremism. They don't know the solution to that, but they went out to the tech sector and found a small AI company that could do takedowns of extremist content. So they were able to see that by engaging with a small university-based startup, they were able to meet their objective. And then in the process of it, which I think is equally as important in this, they went, actually there's probably some other problems that could be solved if we engage with the kind of technology firms we haven't engaged with in the past. So I definitely think the open innovation approach, which we've done over the last 3 years, has brought that art of the possible as well as a bunch of solutions to the table.
Yeah, that's actually a really good thing to tease out, because it's open innovation challenges has been one of the ways that we've been pushing things forward in Sydney, and it's certainly something that our transport department has done a lot of. I think, you know, I think it's one of the tools in the tool belt you have, because, you know, often what you'll find is that it's a great solution, and once you go to scale up, you say, oh, we really should take this out to 10. Like, you have solved for the specific problem we have. There is implications that this could be rolled out in a much larger way. You really need to go to tender on this. And
yeah, I mean, I'd also say that a really important procurement point is something that we're going to address next year, is that authorities who buy IT are sometimes not allowed to access the data that's in their own system and are charged for it, which is a terrible practice. And I don't know how we ever got there, but we have. So we want to insist in the future on open APIs in public IT contracts. And the work by the London Office of Technology and Innovation is taking that forward. So whether it's in tender process or it's in the actual contracts in the end, it's insane that has been standard industry practice. Now, a lot of people are changing from that, but the effect of that has not just been costing people money and not access to data. It's also de-skilled public service teams. We haven't, you know, why don't we have better data capability? Well, just we haven't had access to data in our hands to explore the things that we want to do. So I think that's a fundamentally important thing for a future city.
Good tip. Good place to leave it. Thank you, Theo. That has been a really, really insightful, really wide-ranging conversation. Really appreciate you taking your time. Appreciate it slightly early in the morning there. So thank you. Thank you so much.
All right. You're very welcome.
All right. To everybody, thank you for coming along. Thank you for your questions. Thank you again to Theo. We'll see you at the next event.